What if I told you that the most expensive war in history, costing over $4 trillion in today's dollars, was funded without bankrupting the country? That America, already reeling from the Great Depression, managed to finance a global war effort that spanned 4 continents, employed millions, and built the most formidable military-industrial complex the world had ever seen, all without triggering immediate financial collapse. But here's the catch. While the country didn't go broke at first, the bill would come due later, in ways that still shape the economy you live in today. So how did America pay for World War II? Why didn't it crush the nation's finances? And what hidden costs crept in over the decades that followed? This story isn't just about budgets and bonds, it's about the hidden architecture of power, inflation, and the cost of believing wars can be affordable. To understand how America pulled off this financial miracle, we need to go back, before Pearl Harbor, before Hitler's tanks rolled into Poland, to the darkest days of the Great Depression. By 1933, nearly a quarter of the American workforce was unemployed. Banks were failing. Families were lining up for bread. The federal government, under President Franklin D. Roosevelt, was experimenting with unprecedented economic interventions. The New Deal, Social Security, public works programs. But even these efforts didn't fully revive the economy. Private investment remained hesitant. The national debt, though growing, was still a modest concern, about $43 billion in 1940, or roughly 44% of GDP. Then came the storm. When World War II erupted in Europe in 1939, the United States stayed officially neutral. But economically, politically, and militarily, it began inching toward involvement. FDR called the US the arsenal of democracy, supplying weapons and resources to Britain and the Allies. And once the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor in December 1941, America went all in. But war is expensive. More expensive than any New Deal project or peacetime policy. And with government revenues still recovering from the Depression, the question wasn't just how to pay for the war, it was whether it could be done at all. Here's where the story gets interesting. The initial strategy. War, bonds, and taxes. America didn't start by printing endless money. Instead, the government turned to 2 traditional but massively scaled strategies: raising taxes and selling war bonds. First, taxes. The Revenue Act of 1942 was arguably the most sweeping tax reform in American history. Before the war, only a small percentage of Americans paid income tax. But by 1945, over 90% of workers were paying taxes directly from their paychecks. The top marginal tax rate, a staggering 94%. This tax revolution was both ideological and practical. FDR and his advisors, especially Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau, believed that high taxation was a patriotic duty and a tool to prevent inflation. If the government simply printed money to pay for war, prices would skyrocket, but taxes could only go so far. Enter war bonds. Through an unprecedented propaganda campaign featuring celebrities, posters, and even comic book superheroes, Americans were encouraged to lend money to the government by buying war bonds. The emotional appeal was powerful. Buy a bond, defeat fascism. By the war's end, Americans had purchased nearly $186 billion in bonds, about $3 trillion today, financing nearly 60% of the war effort. On paper, it was a financial triumph. A nation still climbing out of depression had turned into an economic powerhouse, fueled by patriotic loans and progressive taxation. But under the surface, cracks were forming. Between 1941 and 1945, US government spending exploded by over 900%. In 1940, defense outlays were just $1.9 billion. By 1945, they topped $83 billion. And that's more than the entire federal budget of the previous decade, combined. Factories ran 24/7. Entire industries converted to wartime production. Ford stopped making cars and started producing bombers. Women entered the workforce in record numbers. Unemployment vanished. GDP soared. The war had seemingly solved the depression overnight. But the cost was enormous. The national debt ballooned from $43 billion in 1940 to $258 billion by 1945, an increase of 500%. That's nearly 120% of GDP. Yet most Americans weren't alarmed. The war effort had united the nation. Wages were up. Jobs were plentiful. And inflation, though rising, was being contained, through strict price controls, rationing, and wage limits. It was a balancing act. Spend enough to win the war, but not so much that the economy overheated. Behind the scenes, the Federal Reserve played a crucial role. It kept interest rates artificially low at 0.375% for short-term government securities to ensure the cost of borrowing remained manageable. For a time it worked. America was winning the war abroad and managing its finances at home. But victory would bring a new challenge. Peace, aftermath, and inflation pressures. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the war was over, but the economic consequences were just beginning. Millions of soldiers returned home. Wartime production ceased. The country faced a new dilemma: how to transition from a command economy to a consumer-driven peacetime system, without sparking mass unemployment or runaway inflation. The war bonds now had to be repaid. Debt service began to eat into federal budgets. The tight controls on wages and prices were lifted, and prices surged. In 1946, inflation jumped to over 18%. The Federal Reserve, still under political pressure, was forced to keep interest rates low to ease debt repayment and encourage post-war growth. But that meant inflation pressures remained unchecked. This led to a quiet but pivotal standoff between the US Treasury and the Federal Reserve. The Treasury wanted cheap borrowing. The Fed wanted to raise rates to fight inflation. It wasn't until 1951, 6 years after the war, that the so-called Accord was signed, giving the Fed more independence and ending the policy of artificially suppressing interest rates. But by then, the damage had been done. Inflation had eroded the value of savings and war bonds. Many who had lent money to the government at low rates saw their returns vanish in real terms. The government hadn't defaulted, but it had quietly transferred wealth from bondholders to itself through inflation. This was the hidden cost of the war, the long-term legacy. World War II transformed America's fiscal landscape permanently. Before the war, the federal government spent about 10% of GDP annually. After the war, that baseline never returned. Spending remained elevated, now justified by the Cold War, social programs, and infrastructure. The military-industrial complex, warned about by President Eisenhower in 1961, became a permanent feature of the economy. The income tax, once a tool for the wealthy, was now a routine part of every American's life. Withholding from paychecks, introduced as a wartime necessity, became permanent, and the precedent was set. In times of crisis, the government could spend almost without limit, so long as the Fed cooperated. But it wasn't just about spending, it was about expectation. Americans had come to believe that their government could do the impossible: fight a global war, provide jobs, raise living standards, and keep the economy humming, all without going bankrupt. It was a powerful illusion, one that would echo in future conflicts and crises, from Vietnam to Iraq to the financial bailouts of 2008. Failed fixes, attempts to control the beast. After the war, several attempts were made to rein in federal spending and debt. In 1947, the Taft-Hartley Act sought to limit the power of labor unions and cool wage-driven inflation. In 1948, Congress passed a budget surplus, hoping to pay down the debt. But these efforts were short-lived. The Cold War demanded new military outlays. The Korean War broke out in 1950. Then came the arms race, the space race, Vietnam. Each time, the government returned to the playbook of World War II: borrow, spend, and rely on the Fed to keep rates low. The result? Debt kept growing, not explosively, but persistently. By the 1970s, inflation returned with a vengeance. The US was forced off the gold standard, interest rates skyrocketed, and the debt became a political weapon, argued over, but never fully confronted. The lesson of World War II had been misunderstood. Yes, America could fund a massive war effort without immediate collapse. But the tools it used, taxes, bonds, inflation, monetary suppression, had long-term consequences. And those consequences were coming due. Fast forward to today. The US national debt is over $34 trillion. Interest payments alone are nearing $1 trillion annually. More than the defense budget. And yet the mindset persists that America can always spend its way out of crisis. During COVID-19, the government injected over $5 trillion into the economy in under 2 years. The Fed slashed rates and bought government bonds, just like it did in the 1940s. Inflation spiked to 9.1% in 2022, the highest in 4 decades. And again, policymakers were caught in a tug-of-war between stimulus and restraint, growth and stability. It's a familiar pattern. The WWII financing model, once seen as an exceptional response to an existential threat, has become the default playbook for every crisis. But here's the difference. In 1941, the US had low debt, high savings, and a unified public willing to sacrifice. Today, the debt is high, savings are low, and political divisions run deep. The tools remain the same, but the foundation is weaker. That's the danger. 3 takeaways. You can't borrow forever without paying a price. World War II was funded through taxes, bonds, and inflation. But inflation quietly punished savers and bondholders. The government didn't default, but it did dilute the debt through rising prices. That model, repeated too often, erodes trust in currency and institutions. Crisis financing becomes a habit. What began as a unique wartime response became a template for every emergency. Once governments learn they can spend freely in crisis, the line between emergency and routine blurs. Fiscal restraint becomes politically impossible. The Federal Reserve's role is crucial and risky. The Fed's decision to suppress interest rates made WWII borrowing possible, but at the cost of independence and long-term inflation. Today, its dual mandate, price stability and full employment, often puts it in conflict with fiscal policy. That tension is growing. A final warning or a question. America didn't go broke during World War II, but the way it paid for the war created habits and systems that are still with us, and not always for the better. If every crisis is met with the same response, borrow, spend, suppress rates, what happens when the world no longer believes in America's ability to repay? At what point does confidence break? Not with a bang, but with a whisper. Bond markets refusing to cooperate, inflation eroding savings, trust quietly vanishing. So the question isn't whether America can pay for another crisis. The real question is, can it afford to keep pretending that it's free? If you found this story eye-opening, consider subscribing for more deep dives into the untold economic history behind our modern world. Share this video with someone who still thinks wars don't have hidden costs. And let us know in the comments, do you think America can pull off another World War II style financial miracle? Or is that era gone for good? History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. The next verse might already be playing.